One cold billionaire, one brave dad, and a single moment that turns strangers into family. Drop a comment with your city and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. The Bordeaux Hall was the kind of place where every glass gleamed and every candle flickered just so. But tonight, beneath the polished surface, there was unease. Waiters carried trays with rigid smiles, their eyes darting toward the front doors as whispers rippled through the staff like a current they could not stop. "She's coming." Alexandra Sterling. The name alone was enough to make the air shift. A billionaire whose reputation arrived 5 minutes before she did, colder than the wind that swept through Chicago streets in January. They had all heard the stories. The server was reduced to tears because she brought the wrong vintage of wine. The maitre was forced to apologize for a table that wasn't angled to her liking. The kitchen staff was working in silence after a single glare cut through their chatter like glass. Nobody wanted to face her tonight. Nobody wanted to be the one who bore the brunt of her impatience, her disdain, her carefully sharpened words. At one end of the dining room, a young hostess clutched her reservation book with white knuckles. "Do you think she'll notice if I disappear to the back for a while?" she whispered to the bartender, who only gave a nervous half-smile in return around them. The restaurant buzzed, but not with the warm hum of a Friday night crowd. This was tension disguised as activity. Glasses polished twice, forks adjusted, menu straightened for the third time in as many minutes. Every sound seemed amplified, every detail sharpened in anticipation of her arrival. And then the doors opened. Alexandra Sterling stepped inside like she owned not just the restaurant, but the very air within it. Her heels clicked against the marble floor in a rhythm that demanded attention. A black coat, tailored within an inch of perfection, framed her tall figure. Her eyes, cool and assessing, scanned the room with the precision of someone accustomed to command. Conversation faltered. Waiters suddenly found urgent reasons to retreat to the kitchen. Even the music from the pianist seemed to soften, as if the notes themselves bowed to her presence. She paused near the entrance, removing her gloves with measured elegance, her voice carrying easily across the hush. "I despise being kept waiting," she said, not to anyone in particular, but to everyone at once. The words landed heavy, slicing through the room with the authority of a verdict already decided. The hostess hurried forward, her practiced smile trembling at the edges around her. Staff exchanged glances filled with silent dread. This was the dance they knew all too well. An evening with Alexandra Sterling meant walking a tightrope stretched thin between perfection and disaster. And as Alexandra moved deeper into Bordeaux Hall, the atmosphere followed her like a tide, leaving in its wake a silence thick with apprehension in the far corner of Bordeaux Hall, away from the glitter of the chandelier and the sharp rustle of designer coats. "Matthew?" Colin sat quietly at his table. He didn't belong here, not really, and he knew it. His shirt was clean but plain, pressed as best he could manage after a long day's work. The shoes on his feet had seen better years, polished just enough to pass in this elegant setting. To anyone else in the room, he might have looked out of place, a man from a different world seated among Chicago's elite. But Matthew was used to that feeling. At 39, he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had learned not to measure his worth by the cut of his suit or the thickness of his wallet. His worth was measured in bedtime stories read to a 9-year-old girl and packed lunches scribbled with little notes, in the steady rhythm of a man who kept going no matter how heavy the days became. His daughter Lily was everything. And tonight, even though she wasn't with him, Matthew thought of her with every passing moment. The invitation had come from Brian, an old friend who had long since left their neighborhood behind for corporate consulting. Brian had insisted that Matthew needed to put himself out there to shake hands with people who might open doors to something better. "You've got the skills, Matt," Brian had said over coffee one morning. "People need to see that. You just need the right room." Matthew wasn't convinced. Rooms like this made him uneasy. The prices on the menu alone were more than what he spent on groceries in a week. He had arrived early, 15 minutes ahead of time, because that's what he did. Always early, always careful, sitting there. He glanced at the glass of water in front of him, untouched, as if afraid that even lifting it to his lips would mark him as clumsy among the crystal and silver. He told himself he was here for Lily, just as he told himself every time he stretched beyond his comfort. If Brian was right, if meeting the right person could mean steadier work, better pay, maybe even a path out of the constant worry about rent and school shoes, then the discomfort would be worth it. Because Lily deserved more than patched up sneakers and nights where her father came home too tired to do anything but heat leftovers. Yet, as Matthew looked around the restaurant with its velvet drapes and perfectly folded napkins, he felt the weight of eyes that weren't even looking at him. He imagined what they might see: a maintenance man in a world built for people who own skyscrapers, not fix the elevators inside them. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had faced worse hospitals, funeral homes, conversations where he had to explain to a little girl why her mother wasn't coming back. Compared to that, a room full of polished strangers couldn't break him. Still, he shifted in his seat, listening to the whispers about Alexandra Sterling's arrival. He didn't know her, not beyond the name that seemed to turn the air electric, but he understood fear in people's voices, and he could hear it now in the waitstaff moving nervously across the floor. He caught the glance of a young waiter, pale and tense, rushing past, and for a brief second their eyes met, one man carrying a tray, the other carrying the weight of a different kind of life. Matthew offered a small, steady smile, the kind of gesture he gave Lily when she was nervous before a test at school. It was all he knew how to do: face the world with calm, even when everything around him shook. He didn't realize yet that calm was exactly what the storm at the front door was about to collide with. The hush that had swept through Bordeaux Hall when Alexandra Sterling entered lingered like smoke, wrapping around every table and every breath. Matthew felt it even in his corner. The way conversations shrank to whispers, the way silverware no longer clinked against porcelain. It was as if the whole restaurant was holding itself rigid, waiting to see who would dare move when she walked past. He had just begun to steady his own nerves when he realized the storm was headed directly toward him. Her heels struck the marble like a gavel as she crossed the room, her gaze cold and exacting, each step making staff scatter further. The hostess trailed behind, visibly trembling, murmuring about reservations. But Alexandra brushed her aside with a flick of her hand. She stopped at Matthew's table, her eyes narrowing as if measuring and dismissing him all in the same glance. "This is where you seated me," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "No one in this place is worthy of sharing a table with me." The words weren't just a complaint. They were a verdict, cast loud enough for the waiters pressed against the walls to hear, for the diners who had frozen mid-bite to swallow uneasily. Matthew lifted his eyes, calm and steady. He had spent years looking into storms, some emotional, some financial, some that came in the form of a daughter asking impossible questions about why life had to be so unfair. This was just another storm, only louder, dressed in silk and diamonds. He folded his hands on the table, his voice even, without an edge. "I don't think that's true," he said quietly, though his words carried farther than he expected. "Everyone here deserves to be treated with respect." The silence that followed was immediate and sharp. A fork clattered somewhere across the room and then nothing. No cough, no shuffle of feet, not even the pianist daring to touch the keys. Every eye swung toward the corner table where a man in a plain shirt had just spoken words no one else would have dared to say. Alexandra's expression faltered just for a heartbeat. She was used to apologies, to hasty corrections, to people scrambling to fix her displeasure before it turned into something worse. But this man hadn't scrambled. He hadn't apologized. He had simply met her stare and reminded her without flinching of a truth she had long ago buried beneath layers of control and wealth. Her lips curved into something caught between disdain and intrigue. She leaned slightly closer, her tone dipped in ice. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" Matthew's answer was simple, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, but I also know it doesn't change the way people should be treated." The staff exchanged glances, some with wide eyes, others with the faintest flickers of relief that someone had said what they never could. For a moment, the great Alexandra Sterling was the one standing in silence, studied instead of feared. Matthew didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't look away. Years of raising Lily alone had carved patience into his bones, teaching him how to stand steady while the world threatened to collapse. Now, in this polished hall of chandeliers and whispers, that patience was the only thing keeping the air from shattering. The tension was thick, almost unbearable. Yet beneath it was something else. an unspoken shift for the first time in a very long while. Alexandra Sterling was not the one dictating the terms of the evening. She had been challenged, not with arrogance, but with quiet dignity. And everyone in Bordeaux Hall could feel that something extraordinary had just begun. Alexandra held his gaze a moment longer, her expression sharpened like glass. Then, with the kind of deliberate grace that always placed her in control, she pulled out the chair across from Matthew and sat down. The room seemed to exhale, but the silence lingered, every ear still tuned to the corner table. She set her gloves neatly beside her plate, her tone cool, measured, each word chosen like a chess move. "You speak of respect as if it is owed to everyone," she said, tilting her head slightly, her eyes studying him as though he were an unusual specimen. "But the truth is, society doesn't work that way. Money dictates respect. Influence commands it. Without those things, people are invisible. Surely you've noticed." Matthew let the words settle between them, his calm unbroken. He had noticed, of course. He had. He had lived it. Walking into offices where no one met his eyes, standing in grocery lines where people in suits glanced past him like he wasn't there. But he also knew that yielding to that belief meant giving it power. He lifted his glass of water slowly, took a sip, and set it back down with quiet care before answering. "I've noticed people try to pretend it works that way," he said, his voice steady. "But respect isn't something money can buy. It's something people either give freely or they don't. And the truth is, real respect comes from how you treat others when you don't need anything from them." A flicker crossed Alexandra's eyes, something sharp, almost amused. She leaned forward, her words edged with challenge. "Tell me then, do you honestly believe a man without wealth, without power, without a name that carries weight, can command respect in a world built on status?" Matthew's lips curved in the faintest smile, the kind that came not from arrogance, but from certainty earned the hard way. "I don't need to command it," he replied softly. "My daughter respects me because I show up for her. The crews I've worked with respect me because I work beside them, not above them. Respect isn't about power, it's about presence, about dignity." Her posture remained flawless, but her fingers tapped once against the linen tablecloth, betraying the irritation of someone unaccustomed to being met with resistance. "And yet," she said, her tone cutting, "when I walk into a room, everything stops. People bend, they obey. Isn't that proof that money shapes the rules?" Whether you like it or not, Matthew didn't flinch. "It might make people obey." He answered, his voice quiet but certain. "But obedience isn't respect. Fear isn't respect. They're not the same. You can buy silence. You can buy compliance, but you can't buy someone's heart." For the first time that evening, Alexandra did not have an immediate reply. The corner of her mouth tightened, as if weighing whether to dismiss his words as naive or to admit they struck closer than she wanted. Around them, the staff shifted, sensing the tremor beneath her composure. Matthew leaned back slightly, his voice softening. "Money is a tool, power is a position, but dignity, that belongs to everyone. And kindness." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "Kindness is the one thing that proves who we really are." The pianist, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment, let a single note drift into the air, breaking the stillness. Alexandra's gaze lingered on Matthew longer than she intended. She had come expecting a deference, the usual trembling compliance. Instead, she found herself staring at a man who carried no wealth, no title, no armor, but his own calm conviction. And somehow that unsettled her more than any challenge she had faced in years. For a long moment, Alexandra sat in silence, her fork untouched, her eyes steady on the man across from her. The sharpness in her tone had dulled, not gone, but softened enough that something else began to slip through. She drew a quiet breath as though choosing whether to expose what she had kept hidden beneath years of armor. Finally, she spoke, her voice still even, but lined with something raw. "You think dignity and kindness can stand against the world I've lived in?" she asked, her gaze fixed on her glass of wine. "You have no idea what people are capable of when money is involved. Family, friends, even those who swore they loved me. They all turned, they all took. I learned early that affection was just a mask for greed, and when the mask slips, you're left holding the bill." Her words carried the weight of memory, sharper than any insult she had thrown before. She swirled the wine slowly, not drinking. Her tone distant now, almost confessional. My own brother once sold me out for shares of a company I built. Partners I trusted stripped patents from under me, then smiled as though betrayal was just business and love. She paused, her jaw tightening. Love was the cruelest joke of all. Promises turned to contracts, affection to leverage. Every person who claimed to care for me ended up seeing only what they could take. The room once filled with the hum of diners seemed to fade as her words stretched across the table. For the first time that evening, Alexandra Sterling wasn't the untouchable figure who silenced rooms with a glance. She was a woman describing scars no one else could see. Matthew listened, his hands folded loosely, his expression unchanged except for the quiet focus in his eyes. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush to fill the silence. He simply let her speak. The way he had learned to let Lily talk through her fears after nightmares woke her in the dark. When Alexandra finally lifted her gaze to meet his, he answered with the same calm he had carried from the beginning. I don't doubt any of that, he said gently. People can be selfish. They can betray. And what you've lived through, no one should have to carry that kind of weight. He paused, leaning forward just slightly. But punishing everyone you meet for the sins of those who hurt you, that doesn't protect you. It just keeps you alone. Her eyes flickered, the steel in them dimmed by a flash of something more fragile. He had named what she had never admitted aloud. That her power, her sharp edges, her unyielding control were less about superiority and more about survival. You call it punishment, she said, her voice quieter now. I call it self-preservation. Matthew nodded slowly as though considering her defense. Maybe it started that way, but somewhere along the line, survival turned into walls so high no one could climb them. Not even the people who never meant you harm. He let the words linger, then added, and I think you know that for the first time. Alexandra looked away, her eyes tracing the candlelight trembling against the glass. The woman who had walked into Bordeaux Hall with command in every step now seemed, if only for a moment, uncertain and across from her. The man in the plain shirt didn't press, didn't gloat. He simply waited, his steady presence speaking more loudly than any argument could. Matthew let her words linger in the air, the kind of confession that felt heavier than the crystal glass she held between her fingers. He saw the sharp edges in her voice, but he also saw the weight beneath them. And in that pause, he realized there was only one way to answer her walls, by lowering his own. He drew a slow breath, his eyes steady, his voice carrying the quiet gravity of someone who had lived through nights darker than most. I can't pretend I know what you've faced, he began softly. But I do know what it feels like to lose trust, to lose someone you thought you couldn't live without. His hand shifted slightly on the table, fingers brushing the rim of his water glass as though steadying himself. My wife, Anna, she passed away 4 years ago. Cancer. The word fell heavy, yet his tone carried no bitterness, only the weight of memory. We fought as hard as we could, but in the end, it was me and Lily left behind. She was only 5 at the time, too young to understand why her mother wasn't coming home, too young to understand why the woman who tucked her in at night wasn't there anymore. Alexandra's eyes flickered, her usual composure interrupted by the rawness of his words. Matthew didn't rush. He let the truth come out the way it always had, with patience, with honesty. Never dressed up in anything more than what it was. There were days I wanted to give in to the anger. He continued, it would have been easy to believe the world was cruel, that nothing good could come of it. But every time I looked at Lily, I knew I didn't have the luxury of bitterness. She needed a father who could show her that even when life breaks your heart, there's still kindness. There's still hope worth holding on to. He paused, his voice steady, but softer now. So I made a choice, not because it was easy, but because she deserved it. I chose to live with faith, to raise her with love instead of fear, to remind her that even in loss, we don't have to lose ourselves. The restaurant seemed to shrink around them, the clinking of cutlery, the low hum of conversation fading to nothing. Alexandra, who had spent years silencing others, now found herself silenced, not by force, but by the quiet power of someone who had endured and refused to let grief turn him bitter. You're telling me, she said slowly, her voice almost cautious, that you could go through that and still believe in people. Matthew's lips curved in the faintest trace of a smile. Not triumphant, not proud, just true. I couldn't afford not to believe because if I stopped, then Lily would grow up thinking the world is nothing but pain, and I won't let her carry that kind of burden. For the first time in years, Alexandra's cold gaze faltered, revealing something unguarded. She had armored herself with wealth, with control, with distance. But here was a man who had faced a wound as deep as hers, and instead of building walls, he had chosen to open doors for his daughter. That possibility, hope instead of rage, was something she had never let herself imagine. And across the table, Matthew Collins sat in his plain shirt, a man who had lost as much as she had, but who had somehow found a different way forward. Matthew's words hung in the air like a steady flame, soft but unyielding. Alexandra studied him across the table, her fingers resting against the stem of her glass, her posture still perfect, but her eyes unsettled in a way no one else in Bordeaux Hall would have dared to notice. She was a woman used to walls, walls built from betrayal, from power, from the cold certainty that distance meant safety. Yet here was a man stripped of wealth and title, who had faced loss as crushing as her own, and still he spoke of love as if it were a choice that could be made every morning. Matthew leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, his words measured but firm. You know, money's a strange thing. For some, it's a shield. For others, it's a weapon. But at the end of the day, it can't change who we are. It only gives us more chances to show it. A person can use wealth to build walls so high, no one can reach them. Or he paused, his gaze holding hers. They can use it to build bridges, to create something good, something lasting. Alexandra's breath caught almost imperceptibly. She had spent her life convinced that every dollar was another brick in her fortress, another layer of insulation against those who would take advantage. But bridges, that word cut differently. Matthew continued, his tone steady, almost conversational, but carrying a conviction that pressed against the armor she wore. And pain works the same way. When life breaks you, you can let it harden you. You can decide to hurt others before they get the chance to hurt you. Or you can take that pain and choose to do the opposite. Choose to make sure no one else has to feel what you felt. The table between them seemed to disappear. For Alexandra, his words were not simple philosophy. They were a mirror held up to her life. Every calculated distance, every cutting remark, every dismissal of the people who served her. It all flashed through her mind, not as strength, but as evidence of how thoroughly she had let the past dictate her present. She tried to answer, to summon the icy retort that had carried her through boardrooms and negotiations, but the words slipped away before they reached her lips instead. She found herself quiet, listening. Matthew's expression softened, his voice gentler now. We can't control what's been done to us, but we can control who we become because of it. That's where the choice is. For the first time in years, Alexandra felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. She had built an empire on control, on never allowing herself to be vulnerable again. But sitting here across from a man who had endured his own losses and refused to let bitterness rule him, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in decades. Doubt that her way had truly protected her, doubt that her walls had given her anything more than loneliness. The dining room around them stirred back to life, hushed conversations returning, waiters moving cautiously. Yet at that table in the corner, it was as though time had stilled Alexandra Sterling. The woman whose presence could silence a room sat in silence herself, turning over words that had pierced deeper than any challenge thrown at her in a boardroom. And Matthew, steady and unpretentious, simply waited. He wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to impress. He was offering her something rarer than wealth, rarer than power, an invitation to believe that even the broken pieces of life could be remade into something whole again. When the dinner ended, there was no dramatic farewell, no grand gesture. Alexandra simply stood, adjusted her coat, and gave Matthew a look that lingered longer than she intended. He rose politely, offering a nod, and for the first time in years, she left a room not entirely certain she had been the one in control. That uncertainty followed her home. It echoed in the stillness of her penthouse, in the quiet hum of an elevator that carried her to floors no one else could reach. Yet in the silence, she found herself replaying his words, his steady tone, the calm that had disarmed her more effectively than fear ever could. A few days later, a message arrived on Matthew's phone. Short, formal, a thank you for his time. But when he replied, equally brief, equally polite, it opened a door neither of them expected. One message became another. Soon their exchanges drifted from polite acknowledgments into conversations about work, about parenting, about the small, ordinary moments that shaped their days. For Matthew, it was surprising to find that beneath Alexandra's carefully polished exterior, there was someone curious, someone who asked questions not just to control a narrative, but because she wanted to understand. For Alexandra, it was startling to discover that Matthew never asked for anything. No favors, no opportunities, no advantages. He simply spoke with honesty, offering glimpses of a life lived with purpose, even without wealth. Weeks passed, and what began as courtesy grew into friendship. Alexander suggested a visit, tentative, cautious, as though unsure how her presence would be received. And so one Saturday afternoon, her sleek black car rolled down the narrow streets of Chicago's South Side, far from the polished marble she was used to. She stepped out in her tailored coat. Suddenly aware of how out of place she looked against the rows of modest apartments, Matthew met her at the door, his smile easy, his manner as unshaken as ever. But it was Lily who broke the moment wide open. The little girl came bounding to the doorway, her hair in loose braids, eyes bright with curiosity. "Are you the lady Dad had dinner with?" she asked without hesitation, her voice clear, her innocence cutting straight through Alexandra's defenses. Alexandra froze, caught off guard by the directness only a child could bring. She expected judgment or awe or the kind of hesitation adults carried when they recognized her name. But Lily's gaze held none of that. It was simply a child's question, wrapped in curiosity, unclouded by anything else. Something in Alexandra's chest tightened, a feeling she hadn't allowed in years. "Yes," she managed softly, her voice lacking its usual edge. "Yes, I am," Lily grinned, the kind of smile that reached her eyes without effort. "Do you like pancakes? Dad burns them, but I can make shapes." The laugh that slipped from Alexandra was genuine, unguarded, surprising even to herself. In that moment, the billionaire who silenced boardrooms found herself disarmed by a 9-year-old's invitation. She stepped inside the apartment, noticing the mismatched furniture, the toys scattered across the floor, the warmth that filled the small space. It was not luxury, but it was home. And as the afternoon unfolded with Lily showing off her drawings, Matthew making coffee in a chipped mug, and Alexandra listening more than she spoke, something shifted. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of belonging. Not because of her wealth, but because of the simple way they welcomed her in. The first visit turned into another, then another, until Alexandra's sleek car parked outside Matthew's building became a familiar sight. At first, she arrived with hesitation, unsure whether she belonged in their modest world. But slowly, the walls she had carried for decades began to bend. She found herself slipping into their routines, not as a guest of honor, but as someone simply welcome. On Saturdays, she joined them at the neighborhood market. It was a far cry from the private deliveries she was used to. Aisles crowded, prices scrolled on cardboard signs. But she discovered something strangely freeing about choosing apples beside Matthew, listening to Lily chatter about which ones were best for pie. Alexandra carried the bags herself, the weight in her hands oddly grounding. Sunday afternoons meant walks in the park. Lily darted ahead, her laughter spilling into the crisp Chicago air, while Matthew and Alexandra walked side by side, their conversation meandering between small talk and the deeper threads that bound them closer each time. Alexandra caught herself watching the easy way Matthew listened, how he never filled silence with words just to prove something. It was the kind of attention she hadn't known she craved. Evenings brought the kitchen alive. Matthew would set out the basics, flour, eggs, milk, and Lily would declare herself sous chef Alexandra in a silk blouse instead of an apron, rolled up her sleeves and joined in. It was clumsy at first, her manicured nails dusted with flour, her laughter quick and surprised when batter splattered across the counter, but Lily beamed at her, eyes wide with admiration. And suddenly, Alexandra felt lighter than she had in years. One morning, while Matthew fumbled with the skillet, Lily tugged at Alexandra's sleeve and whispered with conspiratorial pride, "Miss Alex makes the best pancakes ever." The words landed with unexpected force. Alexandra had closed billion-dollar deals, earned headlines, commanded rooms full of power brokers, yet nothing had ever warmed her the way that simple declaration did. She laughed then, really laughed, without calculation, without restraint. It startled even Matthew, who glanced at her as if witnessing a side of her he hadn't thought possible. Over time, Lily's nickname stuck. Miss Alex wasn't a title of wealth or power. It was a child's gift of belonging, one that Alexandra accepted with a softness she no longer tried to hide. She found herself looking forward to the evenings filled with school projects spread across the table, to grocery lists scribbled in Lily's handwriting, to the ordinary rhythm of life that money had never been able to buy. For the first time in decades, Alexandra Sterling wasn't defined by her empire or her reputation. She was simply a woman welcomed into a home, invited to share meals, laughter, and moments that mattered far more than her polished office towers. And as she sat at that worn wooden table, flowers still on her hands, Lily's praise echoing in her heart, Alexandra felt a truth she hadn't dared to believe. Happiness wasn't something to conquer. It was something to receive. It happened on a rainy evening, the kind when the city outside seemed to fold into itself. Lights blurred through street, thunder grumbling low above Chicago's skyline in Matthew's small apartment. The power flickered once, twice, and then everything went dark. For a moment, silence held the room, broken only by Lily's soft gasp. But then Matthew struck a match, and the glow of a single candle lit their kitchen table. Soon 3 candles flickered together, shadows dancing gently against the walls. The 3 of them gathered close. The ordinary table transformed into something sacred by the warm circle of light. Lily rested her chin on her hands, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. "It feels like camping," she said, giggling as if the blackout were nothing more than an adventure. Alexandra smiled, watching the child's joy bloom in a space where most adults would have felt inconvenience. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she had found beauty in something so small, so unpolished. Matthew told a story then, one of the silly bedtime tales he used to invent when Lily was younger, about a brave little bird who built a home from scraps of ribbon and twigs. Alexandra listened, her laughter softening into something deeper, something she hadn't allowed herself in years. When Lily insisted Alexandra tell her own story, she hesitated, unused to being asked for anything other than decisions and orders, but under the candlelight with Lily's expectant face and Matthew's quiet nod, she began to speak. Her voice wavered at first, then steadied, weaving memories of her childhood into a tale about a girl who thought she had to build a tower of glass to stay safe. Lily listened intently, and when the story ended, she leaned closer, whispering with complete sincerity, "If Miss Alex stayed here all the time, that would be so much fun." The words fell with the weight of innocence. Simple, but profound. Alexandra's breath caught. She turned toward Matthew, her eyes no longer the polished steel of a woman who ruled boardrooms, but the vulnerable gaze of someone who longed for something she had never dared to ask for. He met her look steady and calm, and in that silence, her truth slipped free. "Maybe it's time I stopped living in that tower," she said softly. The words hung between them, fragile but real, a confession and a choice all at once. Matthew reached across the table, his roughened hand finding hers, their fingers intertwined, not with the drama of a proposal, but with the quiet certainty of 2 people who had already chosen each other through every shared meal, every laugh, every ordinary day. Lily looked at them and grinned as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. "Does this mean we're a real family now?" Alexandra laughed through the tears she no longer hid, her answer woven into the warmth of that candlelit room. And in that moment, the woman who had once lived in a tower of glass felt for the first time the strength of walls built not from money or power, but from love. The next morning, the rain had lifted, leaving the city washed clean together. They walked Lily to school. Alexandra's hand joined with Matthew's, their steps falling in rhythm while Lily skipped ahead, chattering about her art project. The sidewalks glistened, the air crisp. What if I invited you to pause and reflect on the core of Alexandra and Matthew's encounter in this story? What do you observe about how a single act of quiet defiance, standing firm against rudeness, unravels layers of isolation, transforming a billionaire's armored heart into one open to vulnerability and connection. Might this illuminate a profound truth about empathy and resilience, where true strength lies not in power or wealth, but in choosing kindness amid pain, bridging divides that bitterness has built? Consider, in your own experiences, have you ever felt the sting of being overlooked or hardened by betrayal like Alexandra? Or stood steady through loss like Matthew, only to discover that sharing scars fosters deeper bonds? What emotions arise when you envision Lily's innocent welcome melting walls, reminding us that simple gestures of dignity can heal wounds we thought permanent? Could this teach us that life's most valuable lesson is embracing humanity over hierarchy, recognizing that everyone carries unseen burdens, and extending grace not only redeems others, but redeems ourselves, turning strangers into family? Now imagine crafting a heartfelt message drawing from these insights. How might you weave the story's emotional depth into 200, 300 words, evoking tears of recognition while inspiring hope? Let's explore together. Perhaps begin by jotting down the raw feelings stirred by their journey, then layer in a call to action that invites sharing personal stories and subscribing for more tales of transformation. What phrases would make it resonate, urging, share your thoughts below on a time kindness change you, and subscribe to join our community of hearts seeking connection. Share your initial draft, and we'll refine it step by step to uncover that emotional core.